Hi there, it's Carl Irwin with another drum corps analysis. I haven't done one of these videos in a while. I had put up a number of them maybe a couple of years ago where I was comparing, contrasting, and talking about important differences and similarities between the older form of drum corps that we remember from the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, and then what we see today, kind of 2010 and beyond. And a lot of people appreciated that, and they understood what I was saying, and they got the concepts I was talking about. And then there's a few people who didn't get it, and they were ticked. They were just fuming, and it's in the comments section on those videos where they just berate me and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, and they get defensive, mostly about the older drum corps. And I think there's this incorrect assumption that I was somehow suggesting that the older form of drum corps was less than what we think it was. And that's not true. What I was suggesting is that things haven't changed. That the responsibilities of writing visual versus music have been the same all along. It's always been the same. That back then, they were accounting for movement and motion when writing music, and they were accounting for music when writing motion and marching, and that's never been different. The big criticism that's often made is that, well, the drum corps today, they just stand around. They don't move like they used to play harder stuff. Well, that's not true. They move around like they did before, and back then, they often didn't move when they had to play hard stuff. That was how you do it. That's how it's supposed to be done. And I don't mean often. I mean, like, that's how they wrote the shows. When you had the biggest, highest impact stuff going on, those people generally were in low velocity or they were standing still. And I was just demonstrating that. Other things that I talked about was musical writing on the horns, that when you're in the higher tessitura of the instrument, that you use fewer valves. Now, I made these kinds of comments, and people looking at the older shows, they got really defensive to saying, well, they're only using 2-valve instruments. Are you saying you're telling me that that's easier? No, that's not what I'm saying. All of the instruments work that way. It doesn't matter if it has one valve, a rotor, 2 valves, 3 valves, or 4 valves. It doesn't matter. When you're in the higher tessitura of the instrument, you use fewer valves. And that's really what having 2-valve instruments was rooted in, is that you would have a lower key, G, and then you would have 2 valves on the instrument, and everything would be in the higher register of the instrument. Meaning that you only needed 2 valves. You didn't need the third one because you never had to go there, and you would avoid the keys where you would have to use that, right? So, or you would use alternate fingerings, which would allow you to still cover those notes. That is not different. Everything is still the same. Nothing's changed. I wasn't making some comment about 2-valve instruments being easier. I'm also not saying that they were harder to play, because some people suggest that we've moved to B flat and F instruments because they're easier to play for people. That's just not true either. People didn't have a hard time playing G instruments back in the day. I played on a G line. I played back in this era in the Bluecoats on G bugles, 3-valve G bugles in this time period that we're talking about here. And it was not a problem to learn to play on those instruments. They played just like our normal instruments. You're just in a different key, particularly for music majors that were in the drum corps at that time. They were already playing in multi-keyed instruments for their school study. So, it's just, that's not a real issue. That's a made-up problem. What you can do now, though, is that when you have B flat and F, is that you have students come to audition. They can go home and on their own instruments, they can do the audition materials. Or they have easier access to get instruments through their band programs or the colleges or schools or whatever. They can get instruments that are on the key that they're playing for the drum corps audition, which means that there's a universal equity to it, right? That's one of the great benefits of switching to the B flat and the F, especially given that you could use any number of valves. There's no reason to be on the G anymore. So that's really what it's about for the most part. It's not about difficulty and making things easier in terms of the difficulty and calibrating your brains. And, people were able to play on those instruments in the first camp. You do a warm-up, you do a tuning session, and then you get the music out, and everybody could play. It really wasn't a problem. So, speaking of that, this is a TV spot actually from 1993, PBS, the live recording that would broadcast later on, usually around Thanksgiving, right before the camp started again. And there's a segment in here where they talk about horns. So let's listen to that. Wayne Downey,
with the Blue Devils primarily as
of the Blue
director,
Devils,
my role encompasses arranging the
back then, the writer,
as well
arranger,
as teaching hands-on instruction.
Talks about
individually,
these
as
G
well as
instruments
the
that they used at that time.
Musical ensemble itself. The brass section is composed of choirs. The top end would be soprano bugles, which would be much like the trumpets that you see in any marching
Much
band.
like the trumpet
The
that you
choir,
see. It's the same. It's a G trumpet. It's a G trumpet. That's what it is.
Comprised of two different types of instruments: a mellophone instrument that you would see in any marching band, and a flugelhorn instrument that you probably
one step
wouldn't
difference
see in any
than the
marching band,
mellophones that
but
we use
you'd more
now.
than likely see
Which,
in a
by the
big
way,
band.
mellophones are nothing like French
On the bottom,
horns.
the
So the French
contrabass is
horn
much
players
like
and the
the
trumpet
tuba.
players that play on
The
mellophone, even
baritone
today, they're
instrument
playing
is
on
closely
very different
related
instruments than
to,
what they normally
the
play.
trombone in relation
Because
to
of the
what
change in the
its
octave
characteristics,
change in the tessitura and the
responsibilities
fact
are
that
in the
it's not a
arrangement.
double-sided instrument.
And
It's
the
only in F. It's not an
euphonium
F and B
is
flat.
a big
Those of you that are horn players, you know.
generates more of a deeper
This one's a
sound.
little bit different too. Is that you had flugelhorn in this group back then. You don't see that anymore, really, and that was kind of unique even back then. But you only have mellophones instead of flugelhorns and mellophones. Sometimes you have only baritones and not baritones and a few euphoniums. That's kind of come back into vogue where you see euphonium lines again. But there was a period there where you only had trumpet, mellophone and F,
example of arranging,
baritone, and tuba, and it was just those four instruments. And then color instruments you
First,
added.
you're going to hear the baritones play the melody itself from the beginning to the end of the shout. Secondly, we're going to add the alto voice to that to show you the counter-melodic with the melodic voice of the baritone. And finally, we'll add the sopranos with the contrabasses. Sopranos playing the melody, doubling the baritones, and the contrabasses setting that jazz walking bass line underneath.
Yeah, it's the same as it is today.
My responsibility
Nothing's
as
changed.
arranger is twofold.
Same stuff.
First, to create
Right? Just the keys change.
pure
That's
essence
it.
of Don Ellis,
But
notes
it's the
on
same
page.
kind of playing, same kind of
secondly,
writing as we had back then as we have today on these top
to
groups.
give the opportunity to the performer.
There's the one
to
difference in
understand
DCIs is there's
the
more
emotional intent,
drum
to give them
corps
the
that are
understanding
of
how
that
to
caliber
express Don Ellis, the
that are top
character,
groups.
and
You
the
can go well
personality
outside
of
of the finals lineup, and you have drum corps that are just outstanding. And you didn't have that necessarily back then, not every year. You had some that struggled a little bit more than others. There was more of an elite set of drum corps back in this era than there is today. It's less elite now. You look at the whole of the finals lineup and even the semifinals, quarterfinals, and you can watch all of the drum corps perform from beginning to end of the event, and it's all high quality, all very high quality, comparable playing and marching.
The last time they won the championship, the Devils have taken 6 titles. They've been in the top 5 the last 17 years. Probably the closest thing we have to.
This was a 4th place show, but a top brass. And I argue that with this show, if a drum corps played this book today, it could win a high brass title. There's nothing different about what they were pulling off. I mean, they'd be playing on different keyed instruments or whatever, but there's nothing different about what the music is and what the responsibilities were.
They got a hand even warming up. Now let's meet their drum
That's a big question. Is can shows from back then win today? I think in a way, certain aspects of the shows from that time are the same as they are today. Right? Stylistically, aesthetically, I think you have a difference, and that's really what people hate. They hate the change in aesthetics, but that's aesthetics. That's not difficulty. That's not an issue about how hard something is or how accessible something is, or how it's written to make it accessible to players and performers.
And this crowd is ready. Still continuing to rain here, light rain now. They will perform in the rain.
They don't perform in the rain as much today as they did back then, because the things are a little bit more dangerous now with tarps and props and things. There's things that make it a little bit more obstacles on the field. Back then they had less of that to worry about. You'll notice that the guard drops a lot of stuff in this. That's because it was raining and it just was difficult for everybody that night. Slippery. Another comment that's made about old shows is that they used to play more and they played longer and larger parts of music. I'm not sure that's true because if you look at this, Don Ellis, nobody really knew Don Ellis back then. He was a niche progressive jazz musician with a certain kind of sound and orchestra that he performed with. And you kind of had to know about him to know of him. Most of the people there in the audience, they're hearing Don Ellis really for the first time, hearing the Blue Devils play it. And the Madison Scouts played some Don Ellis earlier in the night, too. Outstanding soloists today. Outstanding soloists in this show. This is one of the great examples of a show driven by soloists and small ensembles. Very emotive, slick, clean playing among a wide group of soloists. Here you got a baritone feature. So the responsibility's on the small group there. Big hit by the group. That's a lot like what we do today. Not different, really. Front ensemble feature. Interesting metrical stuff they're doing. Kind of an 8-to-5 stride for that big shout. Notice that they play these complicated lines. Watch this one. Oh, well, that's done. Let's move, right? So they did that back then. They do the same thing today. They did it back then. That's how it's supposed to be done. I'm not dogging on these corps. That's how it's supposed to be done. They do the same thing today. So to suggest that they played all their hard stuff while flying high velocity back then, that was never true. That was never true. They wrote well. Good ensemble shout stuff going on in the background, these hits, while the soloists take care of business up front. Brilliant playing. Another comment that's made in comparison of back then is today. If you've ever been to a show and you've watched a show on recording, you know that they don't sound the same. It sounds quite different live. Always has, always will. You'll hear these soloists on here, and it just sounds like they're blowing the house down, and they didn't have amplification back then. But notice that everybody is up front. They would put soloists up front, and the mic trees there were quite elaborate. They would position them so that they're getting hit on those mic trees, as you can see it waving right in front of us there. And then that would make it into the recording. You see that more backfield back at the front hash. He was much softer back there, playing a lot heavier than some of the soloists have to when they're up front. So you get a nice clean sound of those soloists up front with those mics sitting there on those final productions. It's also easier to hear when they're in front when you're live, too. This is beautiful playing. Just so well done. Drum feature. We still do this today. Not a very long feature. Front ensemble, high velocity drill. Right as the form hits and things slow down, you get that big big shout from the horn line. People miss the focus. They miss the exclusive focus on drill. That's, I think, the biggest concern when people talk about the older drum corps shows versus today. They miss that exclusive focus on drill rather than just a partial focus on good drill and then other things part of the program. And those people would rather see 10 minutes of this than 12 or 13 minutes of a lot more things going on that we see today. Shows are longer today than they were back then by several minutes. There's that ostinato stuff going on in the midline, right? And notice those that have it, it's not terribly high velocity, you know, they're not whiplashing all over the place. Some people, there are a few people, whenever you see fast whiplash drill, always in drum corps, you have to recognize that only some people do that. That's not everybody that's pulling that off. Some people are doing that fast whiplash stuff, but most of the ensemble is actually within an 8-5 caliber range in their marching. The velocity is found in the contrast of moving parts. It's not in everybody hoofing it, right? So you've got to be fair about that. And oftentimes, those people that are really hoofing it, they may not be playing at that moment. They often will cut out on purpose just to make the drill work out. So many solos, so much small ensemble stuff in this show. Brilliant. I love the patent leather shoes, too, back then. The shiny shoes. That uniform was slick. The Blue Devils had this uniform, and like every high school in the country picked it up. You know, they had that open jacket design. Small ensemble down front. Great, tight stage band playing. Now, we still do this, but you would see trombones, right? Trombones, flugelhorns, you'd see some other stuff, more diverse brass instruments. But it's all the same. Brass is brass is brass. Doesn't matter how you move the slide, how you make the tubing longer or shorter. Love it. These guys really had a good control over lip trills, lip slurs. You know, they're very loose players. They had a good brass program back then. I mean, obviously they still do. They're the Blue Devils, but just kind of a head and shoulders in terms of this writing over some of their peer groups at the time. Very, very sophisticated writing. That's great. Yeah. They still march like this today, right? This whole sequence of drill, which is kind of a big impact point for the show right at the end. You know, you saw the Blue Coats doing stuff like this year. The Blue Devils doing that. Carolina Crown. They all do, you know, Boston Crusaders. They all do this stuff still today. Same kind of focus, box rotation, contrary motion stuff. Fantastic show.
That was the Blue Devils of Concord, California.
They were playing tonight. I'll tell you what, they were cooking. That Horline found some extra octane. I don't know if it was from the rainwater or what, but they took Hatfield Brass in the semis, and they were cooking tonight.
Yeah, great show. So, just to reiterate, those of you that are going after me like I'm making some kind of negligent statement about the past, you're nuts. You're nuts. I come from this, right? I fully appreciate it. On the contrary, I'm sick of people dogging on the new stuff. I'm sick of it. I really am. I don't get it. I don't get it. It's the same stuff, right? There are fairly minor aesthetic differences between this and what we see today. If anything, what we see today is very closely related to the kind of staging that we would see, staging meaning positioning on the field, and focus that we saw prior to this era, where you were looking at the 1960s and 70s with drum corps kind of linear forms on the field, where things were centrally staged and focus happened here and then there and then over here, and your head kind of bobbed around, focusing on the next big thing that was happening in the show. That's a lot kind of what we get with today with the field presence of staging and props and the way you kind of position certain groups on the field. It's more circus kind of oriented, right? It's a different kind of visual. But all of the things that made drum corps great in the 90s have not gone away. They are still present. It's all still there, right? It's still part of the experience. When you go out to the lot and you hear the horn lines play, same stuff. Same stuff today as what they did, but you can't tell the difference. You're not going to go out there and say, oh, poor Carolina Crown playing on B-flat and F instruments. If only they were playing on G instruments, they would sound big and beefy. That's just nonsense. It's not true. It's a complete lie. Complete lie. And it was evidenced back in the changeover 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. By then, almost everybody was kind of over onto the other side of it. You had groups that were on the field that were one was one type of lineup and another one was a different, and you really couldn't tell the difference between them. It's not this whole idea that they did things differently back then than they do now, and they do things differently now than they did back then. It's not true. It's the same restrictions and the same considerations back then. So here's another one. Go ahead and flame me, whatever. Yeah. I love Blue Devils 1993, one of my top favorite shows of all time. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Take care.